right. Our first Friday back. We are in. It's hard to believe. Um, Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Our first week of session, day 3, but our first full week is coming to a close. We've had a number of opportunities to have some conversation, so I know that there are some questions. I want to just a couple highlights from this first week. I do want to thank my leadership team in the Senate. We had almost a flawless start of session, and it just feels, as the third year of the term, it felt the most natural it has felt in quite a while. It does feel a bit different with a number of our departures. Former Senators Sarah Elfreth, Jill Carter, and then of course yesterday we had Kathy Klausmeier, which there was sort of no better display of exactly who somebody is than Kathy Klausmeier yesterday on the floor, and now County Executive Klausmeier. Certainly they're individually irreplaceable, but I very much look forward to the folks who are replacing them coming in and getting to build relationships with each of them. I know there were a couple stories, but it may have gotten lost in the midst of opening day with the changes, particularly with Senator Klausmeier leaving. She was the vice chair of finance. We had a number of shifts and movements throughout. And of course, Senator Antonio Hayes is now the new vice chair of the Finance Committee. Senator Clarence Lamb is taking over from him the Executive Nominations Committee with Senator C. Anthony Muse, who will be the vice chair of Executive Nominations. We also added created a new subcommittee, which was something that we'd been considering for a while. We moved all procurement issues into budget and tax last year and realized that it's been such a substantial workload, particularly as we look to find more procurement efficiencies overall, that we could create a separate subcommittee with MB&T. And so Senator Joanne Benson, our majority whip, will be leading that new subcommittee this year, and I suspect we'll have a lot of activity. Certainly, we've talked a lot about the budget, and I do want to note, there's been a lot of questions of how did we get here, and of late, our good friends from across the aisle have really not looked towards the prior administration. And I just would like to remind folks that if you go back and look at the votes, for the Hogan administration and for the Moore administration, particularly in the Senate, it has been almost unanimously approved. So when we think about prior budgets, they were a unanimous approval in the past. And so, I like to diagnose things with facts. And when we look at how we got to where we are today, we know that it's entitlement spending. It's not some reckless spending from years past being caught up. It's and if it is, I would ask my good friends why they voted for the budget. But we did have an excellent symbolic and important debate yesterday on the change of the rules, which was kind of the best of the Senate. It ended up being a unanimous vote, which was not surprising. But I think it did highlight this continuing challenge of, as the issues become more complex, in a 90-day session with a part-time legislature, how do we most efficiently use our time? And so a lot of the big issues were brought up and discussed, and this bill limit is one tool in the toolbox. We'll see how it plays out this upcoming year, and we'll adjust as we move forward. But the issues that we are facing are seemingly more and more complex each year, and in order for us to do our best work, having opportunities to limit the extent of the number of bills allows us to focus in and prioritize a lot better. And so I'm really pleased that we move forward. Other than that, looking forward to this weekend with Ravens and Commanders. It's going to be a great time for the Maryland region and a winning weekend. So, questions?
Back to the budget, but I need to ask you this question. How do you plan to enhance electric energy? Are you going to introduce legislation? How will that work?
Details to come. We've been working throughout the interim to deal with this, again, very complex issue. You will see a leadership package that will be a joint leadership package. The details forthcoming. We're kind of working through some of the specifics, but the goal will be to make it easier to move projects forward in Maryland that help us to generate domestic electricity. And encouraging additional renewable alongside of kind of future-proofing any potential natural gas or nuclear or any of the other similar technologies that we know are available. We want to make sure that anything that comes in that's not renewable can be future-proofed, so can be used for things like hydrogen. But the challenge is that to do any type of energy generation project, it often takes years. What we need to do and finish this year by the time we leave is signal to the marketplace that we are committed and we are putting the policies in place to generate new electricity here in Maryland from sources all of the above.
And speaking of energy, will you introduce legislation or will somebody to remove incinerators from the state renewable energy subsidy program?
Yes, so that's a separate piece that I would say is not necessarily part of that's more as my representation of the 46th district in downtown Baltimore. This has to do with, they are related because our renewable energy portfolio or a renewable portfolio standard does help us to incentivize additional renewable generation. And so the use of it on incineration is something that, I've never thought was the most effective way to use those dollars. And so as the senator from the 46th district, I'll be introducing a bill that removes the waste incineration as a tier 1 renewable source that I hope will pass this year, and we can dedicate those dollars to truly renewable energy generation.
Mr. President, I do want to ask your reaction. The governor announced that he's looking to fill part of the $3 billion budget deficit by finding $50 million in efficiencies, creating a new, essentially a new layer of government that is going to be tasked with finding these efficiencies. Get your reaction to the initial plan and the $50 million of aspirational savings.
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, I think that's absolutely the right direction. We should be looking for efficiencies all the time. I haven't seen the specific details of this particular process, whether it's how it will function, and so we'll have to review it as we get the details. But I appreciate the impetus to look for additional efficiencies. We have to be doing that this year, and part of the legislative budget process will be continuing to find places where we can make government more effective and efficient, and therefore realize some savings. When you look at the new technologies that are available, particularly in the private sector, I think there are a lot of practices and ways of doing business that I think our public sector agencies can adopt. And so be it with AI or new modern database technology, I think there are places we can really have some cost savings and actually deliver results better. I'm hopeful that there's a process for doing this, but I think we should be doing it for all agencies at all times.
Does the state need to hire a consultant to do this, or should this have been something that the state should already be able to do through DBM or the Board of Public Works or any of the other various existing agencies?
I don't know enough about the contract. I don't think that outside consultants are necessarily a bad thing at times. They bring a wealth of knowledge from other states that may have implemented something. So without knowing the specific details of the contract for this consultant, it's hard for me to make a judgment. I do think it should be regular practice within all agencies to be reviewing how government functions and find places where we can do it better and more cheaply, more cost effectively.
President Ferguson, the governor announced $2 billion, that he plans to introduce $2 billion in cuts when he introduces his budget, which I'm sure he will do not before Wednesday, but on Wednesday. Are you anticipating any cuts to state government, particularly when it comes to employees, like hiring freezes, pauses and raises, anything like that?
Yeah, I would anticipate all of the tools are potentially being utilized. And when we move forward our recommendations for the Spending Affordability Committee, one of the things that we really pushed was to use existing vacancies and reclassify them before opening new PINs. Consider every new hire, make sure that it is absolutely necessary. Where we do know that there are going to be necessary new hires, but it should be a very thoughtful process, as we know that we have to live within our means. I think the governor made the right decision by focusing on how we can be more efficient and cut where we can first. That has to be the lens that we start the conversation with the budget. And certainly the budget that he puts in next week, which actually I didn't know. I wonder if I don't know if he could put in earlier. I thought he had to put it in on that day of session, but maybe I'm wrong. I'll have to follow up on that and research that one. But when he
Just a,
yeah, it's in the rules of the day, but I'm wondering if that's the deadline or if he has to do it that day. That's what I have to go back and look at and research that one. But I do think that that's going to be a starting point, and there's going to be lots of conversation. Certainly, we will not take a budget and pass it. There's going to be a lot of conversation, and I appreciate that the governor is going to put forward a number of places where he sees within the administration areas for the state to tighten the belt.
Will you take a budget? How acceptable will it be to the legislature if a budget is sent that only contains $2 billion of the $3 billion in deficit solutions?
Well, I don't think that the administration is able to do that. So they will have to introduce a balanced budget. It has to be, upon introduction, it must be, or at least shown to calculate to be balanced. So I think we will see additional details of how that balancing will occur next week, and I look forward to weighing through it. Again, it's a starting point for what will be a lot of uncertainty with the federal administration, and by the time we hit April, a very different world.
Is it your understanding that there's like a placeholder of using rainy day funds, reserves in order to make up for that, or get to that nearly 3 billion point? Have you heard anything along those lines?
The governor and I have had a number of conversations. I think we agree that using the rainy day fund and dropping it significantly lower than it is challenging, and that we should avoid it where possible. I think tapping into it for some specific purposes does make sense. We put those dollars there very intentionally. And so I would imagine I would see some use of the rainy day fund, but not bringing it down to say 5% or even down as far as where we would generally be. And I know this is something the governor and I certainly agree with, that we need to hold on to that savings account for what is the uncertainty ahead.
Do you anticipate that the legislature will then make further cuts or keep it at the $2 billion mark for cuts to make up this deficit?
I think we will certainly look for additional, we will review it in depth, and I think we'll look for additional places to cut and alter moving forward. I think that our lens will be, we appreciate, it's a starting document. And we are going to take the lens of making sure that we live within our means first and go as far as we can to make sure the programs are meeting that criteria.
President Ferguson, we have heard the word high bar used with a number of government programs, including the blueprint. There's a high bar for cuts to that. There's a high bar before we raise taxes. Could you put a little bit more solid description around what you're thinking this high bar looks like? And kind of my question is, if not now, when?
If not now, when? In which way? Would we do either?
If this isn't the high bar, then what is?
Look, I think we're at the beginning of a bigger conversation. We are laying out the priorities of what's most important for each individual chamber, for the administration, and we're setting forth the important standards that will be kind of the context of the debate for the next 90 days. One of the things that we continue to harp on is the potential uncertainty. And so, every tool will be on the table, and I think that there's going to be robust debate about the balance between cuts and whether revenues are necessary and to what degree. And so, I think we all sort of generally share the same values. We have a high bar as well about education spending. We know that it's one of the most important, if not the most important expenditures that we make every single year. Investing in schools and families is a critical priority. Adjusting programs to match the realities on the ground is different than a cut to education. It's simply matching the facts on the ground. And so, we're all sort of staking our claim for what is going to be the important values, and I feel confident that we share these values enough that we were going to get to a good place at the end.
If revenues are not as big of a conversation this year, how does that impact the next few years? Obviously, the deficit grows and expands at a faster rate. In the next 5 years, it's pretty, 84% of spending is funded for the next 5 years. I mean, how do you see this? Is it possible to do this, if not this year, then next year? Or, will revenue need to be part of that conversation?
Look, ideally, we should be focused on growth. And if we just had a percentage point or two greater GDP over the next 2 years, it has a significant impact on our bottom line, particularly if we can get some of our out-year spending in line with what resources we have currently available. And so adding growth and competitiveness to this conversation is essential because it's not static. Every decision we make will have a marginal impact on choices by business leaders and by families moving forward. And so I would say I am fully confident that we will balance the budget. We've done it for 30 years. We were one of the very few states that maintains a AAA bond rating because we sit down and by the end of session, we balance the budget. How we balance it is going to be the key. But I think that we need to set ourselves up not just for FY26. This is something where I hope by the end that we get to a place where we're set for 2 to 4 to 6 years, that we can be in a good place, knowing where we think we will go, given the uncertainties that come with the federal administration, which I do think is an X factor here. That even in April, by the time we leave in April with a balanced budget, there are the possibilities of something happening in Congress in the summer that all of a sudden we have a 10% shift in Medicaid costs. in which we're going to have to reevaluate yet again.
Could I ask you about that X factor? What is your worst case? What are you most worried about? And I'm also curious how that might be changing the dynamic between you and, say, the Republicans in your own chamber.
I would say on a financial side, I am most concerned about Maryland workers who may be impacted by significant and severe cuts. We have 1 out of every 10 Maryland workers is employed through the federal government, and the number of contractors that rely on federal grants is enormous and disproportionate here in Maryland. And so on a financial side, if there is a $1 trillion cut to government spending, that will have a very real and personal impact on the individuals employed in Maryland, but also on our budget. And so I think that's probably the thing that I'm most worried about on the financial side. On the human side, I'm very worried about what it means to communities and families in mass roundup deportation. We should be coordinating to make sure that people that commit violent offenses and violent felonies are absolutely deported should be detained and deported. Rounding people up is something that I think will have an unbelievably negative impact on Maryland neighborhoods and how people exist in society, in schools, in their communities. And so on a human level, that's what I'm worried about.
Have you noticed any changes in the dynamic with Republican colleagues? Are they asserting themselves more with you? Do you find yourself more in a position to want to include them in conversations maybe they weren't part of before?
Well, I'd say one of the things, the beauty of the Senate is that we, most importantly, we're all Marylanders. And that is a standard that will last no matter who's in the federal administration, and is something that we'll continue to encourage. I'd say, we see what happens in Washington when we get into kind of petty bickering. It's not helpful for the people that we serve. And so my approach will always be, we work with everyone because each of us represents our own individual district. We represent 130,000 Marylanders, not just Republican Marylanders or Democratic Marylanders. We represent Marylanders. And so that will be the standard with which we operate. And I hope that all of my colleagues choose to approach it the same way.
Senate President, circling back to the budget quickly and just kind of how we got here in terms of the entitlement programs. I know you talked a little bit yesterday with me about the price of Medicaid. Looking at the cost, what needs to happen to ensure that the costs aren't continuing to rise without the proper, measures in place or the expectations, the budgeting plans? The projections were off, so what's being done to ensure that that doesn't happen moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is the exact question that we're having with the Department of Health right now, of where within our systems are we making sure that we have the correct eligibility for those who qualify, and that we are checking within the system that every dollar is being used in the most appropriate fashion. A lot of the entitlement programs, though, don't leave a lot for discretion. They're entitlements. So when the bill comes in, it is due. And so it is who is eligible that ends up being a lever of where there's movement one way or the other. But we're not going to throw people off of health insurance because we know that it has that might be a short-term savings if you throw 50,000 people off of Medicaid. But if they show up in the hospital without insurance, everybody else on private plans ends up paying for it through uncompensated care, and it raises the price of insurance for everyone. So it's why it's so important to expand affordable health care coverage for folks, is that everyone bears the cost of an unhealthy society, and I think we're seeing that, unfortunately, it's playing out in the services that are being provided. Throughout session, we're going to have more specifics about how we can dive into Medicaid more specifically to really get a sense of where those costs are coming from.
Some of the critics, though, say that, Maryland isn't any different. People aren't getting any sicker here than they are in other states. So is it really the cost of the care, or is it the policies that have allowed people to take advantage of these services and programs?
Actually, in Maryland, we do have an aging population that is greater than many others, particularly an aging population that uses Medicaid for end-of-life care. That is different than a number of other states. Now, are they facing similar problems and challenges? Yes. But I would say we have an acute challenge here in Maryland. We are blessed to have world-class medicine, but also costs are rising enormously. Here in Maryland in particular, if you ask any conversations with any hospital management or executive, they will tell you the challenges that they're having just filling shifts. And so that means they're having to use contract nurses, and that's driving up costs across the board. Maryland is acutely facing this. This is a very specific Maryland problem. So, I know we are not exclusively facing it, but it is acute for us.
President Ferguson, I know that there's been a lot of conversation about government efficiency, but I guess oversight is also a question. Looking back to December's Spending Affordability Board Committee hearing, the DDA overspent by a significant amount, which contributed to the deficit. How does the legislature plan to I guess, include oversight into the budget while also considering efficiency?
Yeah, so this is another one where we're going to have a hearing next week. This has been a very the DDA overage has been a very frustrating one because I do feel like someone should have caught this or had seen it coming faster than we have seen it currently. My understanding is that it was due to switching of the billing systems between providers and a new billing system that initially overspent, and then we were getting reimbursements from providers. As the systems were switching, that overage accounting didn't happen appropriately. I don't know why, and it's something we have to figure out. My understanding is also there was the potential that some of the one-time uses of COVID dollars from the prior administration were being used to backfill DDA ongoing costs that was not fully accounted for. And so those combined factors of switching systems plus the use of one-time dollars for ongoing costs left us with this $350 million, but we don't have sufficient answers. And it's why the B&T committee is going to be pulling in the DDA, or the Developmental Disabilities Administration, to ask some serious questions to understand how this got as extensive as it is.
Mr. President, I'd like to actually revisit Brenda's question because it's something that we've been talking about for a number of months. For 6 or 7 months, you and others have talked about the high bar for various things. You've been fairly thoughtful in most of your comments over the last 6 years as Senate President, so I believe that you have an idea of what high bar looks like. Why the hesitance to sort of adequately have a frank conversation with the public and explain to them what a high bar looks like and what the trigger might be for something like revenues or the trigger for scaling back some of the blueprint, and just have that sort of frank, like, here's the milepost that might be a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what this session we will be doing, is having that conversation. I will say, coming into session, I don't think any of us expected $3 billion in structural projected overages. And so when I think about a high bar, I felt very confident that we were when we left session in April, I felt confident that we would be able to sufficiently handle a number of the gaps that existed with rainy day funds and with cash balances and tightening the belt and doing sort of typical budget maneuvers that allow us to stay within margins. This deficit is significantly larger than I expected it to be. And it's not because of sort of discretionary overspending. It is entitlement programs that are mandatory expenditures. And so that has created a new conversation about how far can we cut and to what degree will that impact the operation of government in a significant and real way. The challenge at all times is that one person's waste is one person's critical expenditure. So if you look at something like Deep Creek Lake dredging, right, is if there's a Marylander in Southern Maryland that never goes to Deep Creek, doesn't experience the beauty that is Western Maryland, but to them, spending millions of dollars to dredge Deep Creek Lake looks like waste because it doesn't impact their daily life. But what we know is that it is actually a really critical expenditure. Even if you don't go to Western Maryland, having that available in our state is critical. And so, these things are all a matter of perspective and balance. And I think that's why, while it's a challenging conversation, I think the scope of the budget deficit that we have is really going to force conversations about what we as Marylanders will prioritize most or highest and most important for our future in a 21st century economy, and how we can set ourselves up to grow and be successful.
Mr. President, is your caucus prioritizing too much that the state can't afford at this point, given where we are, though?
No, I think reining in costs to be within to meet the commitments that we've made is different than saying that we're doing too much. There's an inexhaustible demand for services and care. Right? There will never be a moment where we are saying that we are able to do everything for everyone. And so we're always in this balancing act of trying to prioritize. I will say Maryland is different than other states. There are a number of states that have significant cash balances, and they don't invest in their developmental disability community. They don't provide the level of healthcare access that Maryland provides. They don't invest in their schools to the same degree and have less results. We know that we are a higher cost state. That is a factual reality, and that is manageable so long as we have high services. And I think when you look at things like the protection of the Chesapeake Bay and investments in communities that really create strong, thriving places, why we have one of the highest median incomes of any state in the country, it's because we invest in the state and its people. So we'll never be able to do everything, but I do think that we do a lot, and we can continue to do a lot. We just have to do it within the means that we have available currently.
Following up on Medicaid and conversation about that, something you've talked about, dental care for seniors, being able to pay for that. And you've talked about on our airways, capital gains tax maybe being a way to stream that revenue. Is that something that the Senate is considering, increasing the capital gains tax?
I would say right now we want to see the governor's budget next week and see where we are and what we can do to really limit expenditures to be within our means. In the world that we have to explore revenues because the gap is bigger than expected, the perspective from, I know, a number of my members in the Senate is that we need to focus on not impacting costs for everyday working Marylanders, and that if we have to look towards revenues, it should be done in a way for those who have benefited the most from the investments that we make and that are doing it here in Maryland may have to be the ones that we focus on who would help us to close this gap, and that they can continue to be successful. We want them to continue to be successful, but we want to do it in a way where it is progressive and thoughtful and not impacting everyday hardworking Marylanders who are just raising a family.
President Ferguson, the Baltimore Banner and the New York Times recently published an article about the Medicaid-funded addiction treatment providers who were targeting poor and homeless people, and the quality of the treatment was poor, and they were taking advantage of the Medicaid system. Have there been conversations with the Department of Health and lawmakers about oversight measures or what have you?
Thank you for bringing that up. It actually reminded me that, to Mackenzie's question, this is an area that we really do need to dive deeply into. One of the choices, the policy choices that we made, was a shift in the way that we fund our addiction treatment services. It used to be more of a block grant per provider, and we moved to a fee for service. That was done because of the opioid crisis, and we know that we needed to expand access to opioid addiction treatment. I have concerns, as the report highlights, and my experience in the city and as a representative, as seeing in communities, we have to make sure that the fee-for-service that's being used for addiction treatment is actually having outcomes and is not a new means by which there are people taking advantage of a payment system. And when you look at the increased cost of Medicaid coverage as it's allocated towards addiction treatment, it is skyrocketed. That's a good thing if we are seeing less people with substance use disorder getting the treatment that they need. If we're seeing a leveling off of that, we have to reevaluate whether that was the right policy and the increases associated with it are the right way to deal with the challenge of the opioid crisis that we know that we still have.
We can do one more, guys. All right, thank you, Mr. President.
All right, thank you all. Have a great weekend.